In this case, if you're hearing gunshots and they're coming from down the hall, you go directly to where you're hearing those gunshots, and you're engaging with these victims as they're running past you. You're asking, where's it at? Where's it at? Where's it at?
Active Self-Protection owner and founder John Correa is proud to be a brand ambassador for Heckler and Koch pistols. The entire Active Self-Protection team loves our HKs, knowing that we can drag them all over the country, shoot thousands of rounds a year through each one, subject them to very little care, and they will always go bang when they need to. Incredibly reliable and a joy to shoot. Please visit them at hk-usa.com, and tell them that the ASP Podcast sent you. Alrighty, gang, we are back once again. This is the Active Self-Protection Podcast. I am your host, Mike Williver, your favorite former Fed. Only for now, by the way, because eventually my guest here, Jeff, is going to retire. He'll be your favorite former Fed, but for now, I'm it. Jeff is a federal agent with an agency that shall remain unnamed for now. He is a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. He also worked for the Office of Special Investigations, and he has been a Fed for 8 years. He's married with 3 kids, and there is another episode that will be upcoming in the next few months that Jeff will be featured on involving an officer-involved shooting, or an agent-involved shooting in this case. We can't talk about that just yet. We have to wait until justice has taken its course, and we want to make sure that that case remains unaffected by anything we have to say here. So that'll be coming up. Jess, thanks so much for being here, buddy.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
My pleasure. So tell us, Jeff, did you grow up in a military family, police family, around guns, anything like that?
I grew up in a military family. My father was not a gun guy at all. He was a crew chief on airplanes in the Air Force. He wasn't a hunter. So no, I wasn't around guns at all growing up. I knew I wanted to be an investigator from a very, very young age, and eventually I worked my way into that through the U.S. military. So
you said you knew you wanted to be an investigator from a young age. I didn't know that. I ended up as one, but I wanted to be a cop, like a street cop. That was my dream as a kid. So was there any particular influence that led you towards that, like a TV show? Did you watch the X-Files, or how did you get interested in that at a young age?
Actually, it was a lot of the Morgan Freeman forensic psychologists. They always portray these. Initially I wanted to be a forensic psychologist because I thought that's what an investigator was. Of course, as I got older and I, got more well-read, I figured out really it's just a detective is what I was looking for, is just kind of the thrill of the chess game of investigations. I was just going to add, I think a lot of folks don't know a lot about federal agents and agencies and what they do, but just as an overview for those who don't know, pretty much every department of the U.S. government has investigators, maybe in some cases more than one set of investigators. So Social Security Administration has investigators. FBI is an obvious one. ATF, DEA, Homeland Security Investigations for Homeland Security, and National Park Service has investigators that work for them. They all fall under the same, it's a numbering system with federal jobs. Every job has a number associated with it, kind of like the military, like an MOS. In the federal government, 1811, 1811 is the code, the number for criminal investigator, special agent. So every department has any number of 1811s, investigators working for it. So it's kind of like, you kind of equate it to the detective bureau of a police department. Say the Border Patrol or park law enforcement, park rangers, or U.S. Park Police or Secret Service Uniform Division are the patrol cops, and the investigators, the 1811s, are the detectives who come in and investigate stuff more in depth than perhaps a line officer would. With all that said, I mentioned that you'd been a Fed for 8 years. Could you tell us very generally what kind of training went into you becoming an agent? Actually, let's back up for a second. I want to talk about the Air Force. So you joined the Air Force as an enlisted member? I did, yeah. And just to clarify, I've been a federal agent for 18 years.
Okay.
I started with the Air Force, much the same as my father and his brothers. And I mean, it was kind of the family business. So I knew at a young age, I guess it almost felt like an expectation, but I don't think it was really pushed on me.
it just wasn't a surprise when that's what I decided to do. And the family was like, well, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Of course. So initially, like my father and his brothers, I worked on airplanes. And an opportunity came up. There was a recruitment when I was active duty to join the Office of Special Investigations, which used to be called the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, but now the Air Force oversees, or OSI rather, oversees both Space Force and the Air Force. So they just took the Air Force portion off. But so much like an entry-level special agent, I was just a military special agent. I took an entry exam, special agent exam, math, English, comprehension, that kind of stuff. Went through a very, very extensive background investigation, interview process. And then just like other federal law enforcement agencies, OSI sends their folks to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center for the initial criminal investigator training program. And then each agency, as you mentioned before, every department of the government has some criminal investigations division, and each agency has their own kind of follow-on school. Most agencies, I should say, do, not every one of them, but so I went to OSI's follow-on school, and off I went. And I came back here into Arizona initially, and then I kind of moved around for a bit.
So anyone listening, any young people listening interested in this sort of thing, there is OSI. There's also the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I work with those guys closely in San Diego. They are top line agents. They're a lot of fun to work with. Very squared away. Nowhere near as good looking or glamorous as they are on the various NCIS TV shows, but that's okay. We still love them. Coast Guard has a CGIS. The Army's what, CID?
Yeah, I actually I work for Army CID too.
Okay, you're a man of many hats.
A little bit, yeah.
So, I think these are great jobs, either to make a career or to get you started and get a foot in the door and get some experience if you're looking to become a federal agent of any kind. And, you get to serve your country. You get to go cool places and see cool things. So I highly recommend it. I certainly enjoyed my time with the federal government. So at some point, you go from OSI to the agency you're at now. What is that transition like? Because there may be people listening who were in your former position that are interested in transitioning to FBI or DEA or somewhere.
Yeah. So, the first transition for me was just getting out of the military. And I was fortunate enough to get hired back by the Air Force as an OSI agent, as a civilian 1811. And then, of course, I moved on to Army CID as a fraud agent before I came to my current agency. But the transition out of the military, especially for those of us that were military brats, you grow up and the military is taking care of you your whole life. And when you get out, it was probably the most stressful and scariest thing I have ever had to do, because at that point, 10 years active service, and I'm just hoping that somebody picks my number, for one of these civilian federal law enforcement agencies, because at that point I had a wife and 2 children, and it was very rough. I was fortunate. I'm more fortunate than some folks, and I did get picked up, and it all kind of worked out. But there was a time frame where it was like I was getting ready to take an armed security job at a DMV in order to take care of my family.
I know those feels.
And so, thankfully, I didn't have to do that. Kudos to those folks that do that stuff. But so I pushed on, and eventually I worked my way over to my current agency.
And that transition, you mentioned being a military brat. My father was a sub skipper, captain in the Navy. And I think I turned 18 when I lost my benefits. I just had a little green credit card looking thing. I'd go to the hospital, I had sniffles or whatever, a broken leg, just go in, they would just take care of it. That's all I ever knew growing up. And then I had that removed from me, I think when I turned 18, and needed some medical stuff done and didn't know anything about it. Had no idea. And my dad couldn't help me. He didn't know the first thing about health insurance. He never needed it. He'd been in the Navy since he was, 18 years old. So that is a transition. That's a real thing. I can vouch for that. I ended up with several tens of thousands of dollars in medical bills because no one told me I had to see I had to get a referral from a GP before I went to a specialist. No one explained that to me. I called the insurance company. Story for another time.
Yeah.
But it still sticks in my craw a little bit.
Yeah, that was, I mean, it is kind of interesting because when I was getting out, I never thought about healthcare as a military member. You just don't. You pay, for your family, you pay $30 out of pocket. I mean, it's very cheap. It's tantamount to Blue Cross Blue Shield or whatever it is that you have in the civilian world. But when I was getting out, I mean, that price rose from 30 to 330 a month or
right.
whatever it is, and so and thankfully, I was fortunate enough that I prepared myself and got educated and all that stuff that I was able to land a gig that took care of that. I know there's a lot of less fortunate folks that's not the case, but we're just grateful that it worked out that way. But that was a stressor for sure, getting out. And I'm going, oh man, how am I going to, pay for medicine if one of my two little girls, at the time gets very sick or something. So,
yeah. At one point I was a GS9 step 5 living in San Diego, married with 4 kids. There was no overtime, no law enforcement available, no AUO, no, none of that. And I took a bus down to a less prestigious job that had overtime and details available just to be able to feed the family. So I know that feeling very intimately. It took me 14 months after that to get picked up as an 1811 eventually. But right. Real quick, let's touch on the training you get. It's not the same for every agency. So for example, ATF is going to do specialized training on firearms identification and how to make a semi-automatic gun, a fully automatic gun, and tricks of the trade, how to blow stuff up.
Right.
Different agencies have different forms of training, but for the most part, most of it is pretty much the same. You have to go through an investigator school, then an add-on for most agencies. So you had already gone through the criminal investigator training program, or CITP as we call it, with the Air Force. So you didn't need to do that when you transitioned to the other agency, right?
Correct. Yeah. When I walked in on a Monday and with the Army still to this day doesn't send folks to FLETC. They go to their own school. So when I walked in, they just handed me a gun and a badge and showed me to my office. When I left the Army and came over to my current agency, I did have to go to a 14-week follow-on school back at FLETC. So
yeah, I would describe, for anyone who's been through a boot camp or a police academy for a local or state agency, I would compare FLETC to more like a college atmosphere, more relaxed.
Yeah. Yeah.
When they told me that my bed would be made for me every day, I was like, wait, what?
Yeah. Yeah.
I leave, I got maid service. I mean, it's not bad. Anyone tells you FLETC is tough is pulling your leg. It's not. It's
yeah. It's kind of funny because when I went through as a military member, as a military special agent or a special agent candidate for the military, there were other paramilitary organizations such as, I think, Border Patrol was still kind of phasing out of Glencoe, and they were pushing over to Artesia and all that.
Yeah.
But I think between the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection, I mean, these guys were marching around everywhere like they were in the military, and me and my fellow actual active duty military members were just kind of, hey, how's it going? Walking around.
Yeah.
Like, it's just a weird thing to watch because we're the ones that you would think that would have been marching, but we definitely weren't. So
yeah, I remember that being in my little goofy immigration customs enforcement academy uniform. It was bad. Nothing I'd want anyone to see me in. And
riding a bicycle as an adult,
yeah,
all over campus,
riding a bike to the chow. But just bebopping around the campus. There was no marching for me to do, but I'd see the Border Patrol, like you said, or CBP, and they're marching in lockstep everywhere they go. And I'm like, I feel so bad for those guys. But Border Patrol agents are very proud of their academy and very proud of their agency, and as they should be.
Great.
As we record this, as an aside, it was a BORTAC unit, I believe, that were the first ones through the door, as far as I know, the information I have now, in that awful school shooting the other day. So I want to talk about that just for a moment.
Sure.
BORTAC guys, I don't know. I don't know any details about why the local PD or sheriffs didn't get in there sooner, if there was an obstacle or whatever, or they were told to stand down. I don't know. But I don't like the optics of there being someone actively murdering small children and the police aren't doing absolutely everything they can to get through that door immediately. We've hopefully, I thought we'd gotten away from the mindset of the most important thing for law enforcement is we go home at the end of our shift. That's not the most important thing. When you sign up for a job like this, one of the possible outcomes is you get killed doing your job, trying to protect other people. So I assume you've been through some active shooter training. I know I have. Not second guessing these officers in Uvalde just yet, but as a federal agent who I can divulge now is also on our version of a SWAT team, a special response team, you show up with to that school for any other reason, off duty with a pistol. You hear shots ringing out. What do you do?
I mean, so we part of what we do with our unit is train our investigators on handling those types of situations. And I'm not an expert. I'll be the first to say that. I've been through the training. I've instructed the training. Generally speaking, if you're by yourself or if you are showing up to the scene and there are, let's say, 3 different agencies, but we're all cops. It's basically get together, form up, direct to stimulus, and go to the threat directly, and don't stop until you get to the threat. And it's an unorthodox method of what law enforcement is used to, but it has proven, I guess, to be effective, right? And its origins, I believe, stem from how law enforcement handles hostage rescue. And hostage rescues, which obviously is a part of the mission of a SWAT team, you go direct to threat when you're receiving stimulus. If you're not receiving stimulus, then you have to slow down and start kind of methodical clearance to where until you get stimulus. Basically, you're clearing every single room. But in this case, if you're hearing gunshots and they're coming from down the hall, you go directly to where you're hearing those gunshots, and you're engaging with, unfortunately, these victims as they're running past you. You're asking, where's it at? Where's it at? Where's it at? And they should, you should be taking that intelligence and analyzing it, and then combining it with obvious stimulus that you're getting and going to direct to threat. That's the training that I've been given. That's the training that I've instructed. I believe that is still, for most agencies, that's what's being taught. The unfortunate part is, and kudos to those BORTAC guys, I've gotten a little bit of the internal information on that. And then what everybody else has in the public. It's unfortunate that decisions were made and things didn't happen the way they may have should have. Best I know from the news, they were waiting, or what I saw in the news was they were trying to figure out how to breach the door where the shooter was at. And then past that, I know, some BORTAC guys showed up, and I've seen pictures of the gentleman who was, the hero that took this guy out. He had his hat, he took a round across his head. So he had some staples on top of his head. And then I believe one of the other BORTAC guys got shot in his leg. And BORTAC, for those of you guys that are listening, that is the Border Patrol tactical team. They are the SWAT team for the U.S. Border Patrol, and they're extremely well trained. They have a very, very difficult selection and assessment process that they go through just to get into the BORTAC, and then they are a full-time tactical team. They specialize more so in if I'm not mistaken, you tell me, Mike, you probably know more than I do, but they specialize more in kind of mountain terrain, infill, exfil, a lot of scouting and spotting for the various drug cartel groups that are coming through the U.S. border.
Yeah, I would say BORTAC, of all the tactical teams that I'm aware of in the United States, they have the most unique skill set and mission, I think. There's probably there's probably a sheriff's department SWAT team somewhere along the border that has some sort of similar training or similar mission. But the idea is these guys they're more paramilitary, I think, is what I'm trying to get at. So they're going to hop on board a Black Hawk and get dropped out in the middle of nowhere, get dropped on a mountaintop, in some really harsh conditions, and have to deal with whatever they're dealing with. And there's no backup for them. These guys need to know what they're doing. They need to be effective and efficient because with the places where they're operating, there's no calling for more help, generally speaking, unless there's more BORTAC guys, because they're potentially eating a giant poop sandwich in the middle of nowhere on a jagged mountainside. The terrain along the southern border is frequently very daunting, very difficult to work in. I know we had a PA murdered out in San Diego County not that long ago, a few years back, Agent Rosas, and I just remember that was cartel guys coming through somebody's garden, a load of dope on foot, and they just shot him for trying to take that load down. There was a park ranger, Organ Pipe National Monument, that was murdered, LE ranger that was murdered by drug cartels. So this stuff happens. I think, not to change the subject, I think if the average American saw what went on a daily basis at the border, they would be, I'm not even talking about migrant caravans, they would be absolutely astonished at what goes on at the United States, especially the southern border. Mexican army and law enforcement assisting cartel people, assisting drug smugglers, incursions into the United States by foreign government members, whether it's, military or police or whatever. It's absolutely insane. And I think for some reason that has not really reached the consciousness of the average American. But with all that said, BORTAC absolutely squared away, and it sounds like they did their very best. From the last thing I heard was they were told we're still not going in, and they were like, screw this. They just went without permission.
That's kind of what I heard. And it's kind of funny. A good friend of mine that goes to my church, he's a Border Patrol agent. He's not a BORTAC guy, but he's a Border Patrol agent. And we were kind of talking about that because one of our fellow parishioners was saying, hey, why didn't they go in? And I said, well, I don't know. I'm not here to Monday morning quarterback anything, but somebody went in eventually. And I guess, if we're going to try to find the positive in it, those guys decided to take action. And I have no idea why they did that. I don't want to second guess the decisions that their command staff made. I think that'll all come out in the wash and the Department of Justice review. But here's what I will say. There's not a Fed in my agency and other agencies here in Arizona that would allow, I guess, or even listen to any police officer or anybody that said, hey, we're going to hold. I don't think a lot of us have it in us to not do that. And that's what you saw with those BORTAC guys is with zero regard for their own life, went in there, zero. And that's exactly what I think anybody that's worked with those guys have come to expect from Border Patrol agents. They're selfless, they're humble, and they sacrifice a lot for our country without very little credit for what they do, going administration to cultural change to political change. These guys are out there every single day trying to make a difference. And here is what they did when someone else wouldn't do it. And good for them. God bless them.
Yeah, like I said, the only thing I can imagine where I wouldn't be critical of the initial LE response is if there was literally no way to get in where they were going. Somehow there was some sort of block they couldn't get through. Other than that, you need to get in there and handle it. I went to the same firearms instructor course you did in Fort Benning, Georgia, and had probably most of the same instructors who I won't name by name here, but we all know who they are, who are in this community. Great group out there. And I just remember one of my good friends from CITP, I'll just say his initials, GW, sat up in front of the class and said, look, there's we're going to give you this active shooter training, right? We're going to put you through scenarios. We're going to put you in the kill house. We're going to put you under stress and under cognitive load to where you have to, run into a building by yourself and run towards the gunfire and find the threat and eliminate it. He goes, that's all well and good. And this is good training. Pay attention to it. But there's 2 steps to dealing with an active killer. You ready? Find him and kill him. That's it. That's the bottom line. All the other stuff is great to know. All of the tactics are great to know. But, you've got to get to that threat and end it. You can't stop to help injured people. You can't stop to help injured children. You can't stop if there's an IED on the floor. You can't stop no matter what until you get to it. And I just hope that there's enough discussion after this event that there's no excuse for this anymore. I said recently, we learned after Columbine. That's something that I said out loud on one of my videos. And one of our commenters was like, did we though? Because I just saw what happened. Did we learn? And I'm like, well, I said, I'm not going to make any comment on what happened in Texas because I wasn't there. I don't know all the facts, but what I saw didn't look good. I know what I would have done. I wouldn't have listened to anyone telling me we're going to hold, you can't go in there. Not because I'm brave or special. That's just how it should be. I touched earlier on that. The most important thing is we get home at the end of our shift mentality that used to be really, really popular. I hope that's changed. I hope it's at least changing because that's not what you signed up for. Another guy whose name I won't mention, Skip, at Fort Benning got up and said something to the effect of, you can't not go. You signed up for this job, and part of this job is dangerous, and this is what we're talking about here today. How would you characterize the overall firearms instruction program, and to include the active shooter program? I don't know what classes you took in particular, but I thought these guys really had their poop in a group.
Yeah, they really emphasized what is lacking. It was a bit refreshing because it was we talked about this before we started. I maybe had a little bit of an ego walking into that class, being a SWAT dude, thinking that I was a better shooter than I was, and very quickly had to eat humble pie because their focus is reactive shooting. And I know that you guys talk about this in your videos. You talk about it in the podcast all the time. The only way to buy time when you are reacting is to train. That's it. You have to build neural pathways in your brain that make what you're going to react to subconscious competency. Excuse me. And that's what they teach there. And it was an excellent course. The guys, some guys maybe didn't get out of it what I got out of it, but it was one of the best firearms courses I've ever had. And I came back and kind of, as I reflect on that, I think that we should teach every agent that course. Every agent should be going through that course. I don't know why we're not, but I mean, obviously, it's the government. It's probably money and resources and stuff like that. But when I teach firearms, and I should preface that I don't usually instruct for field agents. I'm instructing candidates for the team, for the SWAT team, and guys that are already on the SWAT team. So the proficiency level is a little bit higher, maybe not as a candidate, but they generally, when they come and they want to try out, they put in a lot of time and effort because our standard is a little bit higher than the average agent standard. So when I have to go back and help out with instruction, some folks that I see in law enforcement, especially investigators, they just want to investigate, and the gun is kind of a secondary thing. And it's a little sad sometimes because I don't know how we can emphasize just how much training can save your life and your partner's life, and more importantly, the lives of the public that we're there to protect. And it seems sometimes the government as a whole, not just our agency, but doesn't put a lot of emphasis on the training aspects of what we do. And you hear guys in the military in these podcasts, you hear some politicians, but there's a lot of it in the media and social media, Rogan, and the like. And they talk about, we need to invest in more training. We need to invest in jujitsu for our cops and ground fighting and all this type of stuff so that they can survive. We need to invest in health and fitness, make it a priority, because that's also going to assist you in kind of fighting for your life and stuff. So hopefully one day we'll get there. I don't know what the answer is. It's not going to come from little old me, that's for sure. I beat that drum to death all the time, though.
You mentioned earlier, your priorities change in every agency, but especially hot button agencies that deal with hot button stuff. So like ICE or ATF, your priorities change wildly when one or the other party gets into office. We don't get political here. We try to avoid it. But if you go from Republican to Democrat or Democrat to Republican, you could be working a big case and they're like, yeah, that case is over. We're not doing that case anymore. Or they just stop funding it or whatever the case may be. And that can be very, very frustrating. And I used to tell my partner, I'm like, I can't care more than the American people do about enforcing this or that law. If they don't want it enforced, and my supervisor and her supervisor and his supervisor all the way up to the president don't want it enforced, I can't fight that. You know what I mean? I'll do my best to do my job, but I can't fight the tide of the entire government from my first line to the POTUS saying, don't do that anymore, do this instead. With that said, we talked about the difference between, for example, firearms instructor versus a line agent or supervisor. Firearms instructor has to qualify with a higher score, base score, than an average agent. SRT SWAT team agent, he or she has to qualify with a higher base score than any other agent. And I know what you mean. You go to, I look at it this way. If you take a cross section of all the agents in probably any agency, it's kind of like the political spectrum. You got the 10% on one end, the 10% on the other. The people that are just awful and probably shouldn't even be carrying a gun, but somehow they make it through. And the 10% who train all the time and take it super seriously, maybe too seriously sometimes. Then you got the other 80% in the middle. And that's not it's not linear. It's a spectrum, and it kind of moves over the map. But you have people that couldn't be bothered. They hate going to the range. They hate training. They hate getting their hands dirty or getting sweaty or whatever. And I don't know. And they frequently have a bad attitude, and there's nothing I can do for that guy or gal. If they're not interested in getting better, I can't help them if they're not personally invested. And if the agency doesn't start taking guns away from people sooner, quicker, and getting their attention, that if you don't take your training seriously, you're not going to be employed here for very long, that's not going to change. I loved working with a struggling student who had a good attitude. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah.
They wanted to get better. They just needed a little help. They needed a little bit of instruction. Have you encountered that person in your firearms instruction career?
I have. Actually, recently, it was a group supervisor named, and you know who is. And I was out helping our senior firearms instructor, and she was struggling. And it was a new weapons platform. I think she had, I believe it was the 365 XL or maybe the regular one. I'm not sure. She does fine on the 320, and then we go to qualify on the XL. And, just kind of, it looked like birdshot, to be honest.
Right.
You've seen it before. And so, I watched her shoot. That's the first thing, right? You can't look at a bunch of bullet holes in a target. Any firearms instructor that says they can do that, maybe I haven't been doing it long enough. I don't know, but I can't see holes in paper and tell what you did wrong. And I'm not I'm not a champion shooter or anything. I know how to teach people how to shoot better, and you got to look at it and you got to watch them. There's numerous things that you're doing simultaneously in order to get that round to go point of aim, point of impact to where you want it, right? Everything from grip to physical focus to trigger pull, trigger anticipation, sight alignment. If you're doing, obviously iron sights, recoil management, there's just a ton of stuff. And so just watching her, we couldn't get her there that day. We got her barely above qualifying. And so she was that person that you were talking about. She's like, I don't know what to do. And I said, well, if you would like some one-on-one, then let's meet, every Wednesday.
Yeah.
Because for me, I'm just helping a fellow agent. And I look at it like, if she can shoot this platform, especially as a supervisor, some of them, they like to carry the more compact guns because they're not, necessarily doing field work all the time, but she needs to know how to run that gun. And being, she absolutely 100%, let's do it. And she put in the time and she got better. Mm-hmm. It was very simple. It was a very simple fix. It took 3 or 4 training days. And then, of course, as you know, as a firearms instructor, dry fire on her own. She has to, dry firing is so critical. And a lot of folks don't realize just how much you get out of pulling the trigger and doing some dry fire drills. If you have a firearms instructor, they can tell you there's a lot of different drills out there that you can use for focusing on different things, obviously. And she put in the time and it worked. And the next time she came out, I mean, she qualified with that weapon higher than the minimum standard for a SWAT guy.
Nice.
We'll say that.
I love to hear that. And no, I had no doubt that would be the end result. So we talked offline earlier, as you mentioned, about going to FI school. You went to FI school for your reasons. I went to FI school because I was a B+ average shooter my entire law enforcement career. And I'd been in law enforcement for, I don't know, maybe 12, 13 years total when I went to FI school, and I went to get better. I knew that if I went to this class, I would personally have to get better to pass all the qualifications and the examinations that would be done there. And I had instructors come alongside me as a struggling shooter before FI school. And I was inspired by those instructors to go be an instructor and be that guy who, when I see someone's like, oh no, because, technically, if you can't qualify with your firearm, you can lose your job eventually. And losing your job is not fun. I wanted to be the guy that could come along, an agent, and say, hey, do you want me to work with you a little bit? Maybe we could try this, maybe we could try that, and try to get them squared away. And there's no better feeling than when that light bulb goes on. And I'll give you a quick story. When I went to FI school, we had a SRT guy from a different AOR, not Arizona, come, and he's a great guy. He wasn't cocky or anything like that. He wasn't a showboat, but he was confident, which is fine. I don't mind that at all. He was quietly confident. And I knew him through some other people, and we were slapping each other's backs, getting along, telling jokes. And then came the simplest part, really, of the whole thing, where I don't remember the exact drill, but there's a giant target, and you have to get some ridiculously small number of rounds in a really long time period of time into that target. I don't know if they still do it or not, but it seemed like a really simple thing. He throws a round. He throws one round, and then I watch him unravel. I watch that got in his head, and he's like, "What? No, it doesn't happen to me." That got in his head, and he just descended into range hell and never came back from it. They had to send him home. So wow. I know, I've seen it firsthand. And I'll tell you one more anecdote. Normally I let my guests talk more, but I have a lot to say here today. There was a day post FI school. I'm at the FI range day. We came out early that day. This is in San Diego, not Tucson. We came out early to qualify the FIs before everyone else came to do the regular qual day and the training. And I was blowing it badly with my normal everyday, serve. I wasn't qualifying, what I'm telling you. It has never happened to me before. I mean, I've shot, just okay before, but never failed to qualify. It was unheard of. And I'm like, what is going on? And I'm getting nervous, and you get in your own head after that, after you do something like that. One of my buddies, I think it was Andy, is standing to my right. He goes, "You're holding your breath." I said, "No, I'm not. Talking about holding my breath. Get out of here." Because, a student on the line doesn't realize some things they're doing. Like with the old Safariland, not the ALS, but the SLS holster with that little stupid hood and the button, where they reach down, defeat the retention, and then establish firing grip, and then draw the gun. It was like 8 steps to get the gun out. Sure enough, I was holding my breath. I didn't realize it. I wasn't conscious of it. Sometimes it just takes somebody else looking at you to give you the one thing you don't realize you're doing or not doing to get to that next level and to get better. Even Tom Brady needs a coach. Well, that's actually questionable at this point, but Tiger Woods has a guy who critiques him and tells him what he can do better. So as a cop, especially, don't be afraid to take instruction, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I kind of had a similar thing. It was in the middle of FI school. So I'm sure, when did you get into law enforcement? 05, 03?
Me?
Yes.
Oh no. Federal law enforcement, 96.
Okay.
I'm old.
Yeah. So, yeah, you're. I got in 05. Of course, I had some experience, in the military. You have to qualify with a M4 and a pistol sometimes, and I wasn't the greatest shot. But anyways, I'm in FI school, and when I went through my initial law enforcement school, the training I got in terms of magazine exchanges, right? And it's just such a very simple thing. Was drop magazine, index, put magazine in, rack slide, two-handed, do the slingshot. Yeah. And we were doing that drill where it's like a 3-second drill at, I think, 5 or 7 yards, where you have to basically from the holster, I think it's like an 8-inch steel plate. You come out, you put a round on target, you do a magazine, an emergency reload, you put another round on target. And the target turns at, I believe, 1.5 seconds. It faces away and it turns back at 2 seconds, and you have a full second to shoot it again. Right. I couldn't get it. I couldn't get it at all. One of the guest instructors pulled, he was walking by and he's like, "Quit slingshotting. You've got a
slide release,
a slide release. Yeah. What are you doing?" And I'm like, I can't stop doing it, and I kind of talked about those neural pathways. And that was one of the things that, those guys emphasized there was, if you have bad habits, don't get discouraged. You're not going to change those overnight.
Right.
You have to train. It's going to take you another 10,000 reps of doing this. And no kidding, that was in the beginning of the week, that first week of the 2-week school. And I literally was so upset with myself that I couldn't change that immediately. I spent the next 4 days going into the weekend. Every spare moment I had empty magazines. I had my duty belt on. I brought a pillow into school, into the class, so that I could lay it on the table and literally start with a slide, rack to the rear,
right.
Drop magazine, reload, hit the release with my thumb, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And then I was doing it in my room for 3 hours a night, to a point where I had a blood blister on my right thumb. And we never shot the drill again. Ever again.
Right.
I had no idea I thought we were going to do it again, because it's a points-based course, and we never did it again. But I say that because even though I did all those and I continued to do them throughout the course, it took me another 3 months to get rid of the habit of slingshotting. And we go back to reactive shooting, and we go back to law enforcement or even civilians. When you're in a critical incident, training before that critical incident is going to be key in your survival and how you fight your way out of it, whatever the situation is. And just something as simple as that took me 3 months to redo 12 years of prior repetitions of doing that. So, how many other thousands and thousands that I've had. And then of course, and they don't teach that method anymore. So when I see SWAT candidates come in, it's kind of interesting, because it's kind of awesome that I don't have to emphasize that. But on occasion we get an older guy or an older school dude, and they'll come in and I go, "Oh, I see what you got going on here, pal. Yeah. You're about to experience what I did for the next 3 months, So
let's talk about a couple things before we let you go, because we are running out of time. First thing, bad advice. If you are an instructor or even a student in a class and you see someone in a position of authority dispensing clearly bad advice, has this ever happened to you, by the way?
Yeah, 100%.
What do you do?
I well, for me, because I'm direct and I don't have a filter, I correct them immediately.
I can confirm that.
Yeah, I won't. If you're in a classroom environment and you're an instructor and you're giving the wrong information, the reason that I'm an instructor and the reason that I do the SWAT stuff and law enforcement is because I wanted overall, when you get down to the weeds, I just wanted to help the community, really. And I'd say 99.9% of all law enforcement, if you really get into the psyche of why we do what we do, it's because we wanted to help the community. We wanted to serve and protect, just like, the cliche statement is, but it's the same thing when I do instruction. If you're telling people the wrong thing, I look at it like that could cost them their life, and no way I'm going to allow it. And so for any instructor out there, if you hear bad advice, maybe my method isn't the best way. Maybe pull them aside, talk, hey, this is kind of like this, the way you said this, maybe, I don't know if you meant it like this, maybe articulate it different, but that's false or that's incorrect. You got to correct it. And some way or another, it has to be corrected to the students. So,
yeah, I was going to say, me and GW were not spring chickens when we went to criminal investigator school. Half of our class was from another agency completely, and they had different guns than us. And I won't name the make of the model, but the problem is that this was a new gun for the agency, and when they were doing emergency reloads, they were dropping their mags to the ground. The mags were exploding. The base plate would fly off. Spring would go everywhere. So the instructors, their way to fix this temporarily was to have the agents on the line catch their falling magazines, put them in their pocket, draw a magazine. These are brand new agents. This is their first instruction ever. So they have no neural path. This is their neural pathway at this point. This is their muscle memory. And we made some noise about that, because that literally is exactly what happened in Miami to the FBI agents who they found spent brass in their pocket from catching their brass from their revolvers, putting it in their pocket and reloading like they did in the range. How you train is how you fight. Speaking of training, give us a brief overview of what it's like for a federal agent, because we had a local officer here not long ago from a major metropolitan department who went from the Marine Corps into PD and then went SWAT. So what is the selection and the training process like, as much as you can tell us, of course, as a Fed going into a tactical team like that?
I think all of them are probably culturally, they have their own kind of way of doing things. Generally speaking, the courses are going to be 2 weeks to 3 weeks. So for our team, there is a fitness standard and a shooting standard. You have to meet the minimum. And then what we do, and this is kind of taken, a lot of teams are doing kind of very similar things. We put you through micro use of force scenarios. And not a test of how you would handle something as a SWAT guy, but you're trained law enforcement already. We want to see how you would handle it based on what you have now. And we put you in very, uncomfortable, as real as we can make them situations. And we assess that. And then we also do basic clearance, tactical clearance. Some folks, like civilians here, cutting the pie and that kind of stuff. But for us, we just call it entry tactics. In most SWAT communities, they call it entry tactics. So you get through that. Of course, there's also a board interview. And that's generally speaking, it's just kind of a way for us to see what your personality type is. We just ask you uncomfortable questions. Sometimes we ask you, scenario-based questions, and then we go from there. For us, if you make that cut, we changed our program, and I think it's been a very positive thing. And a lot of teams have changed the way that they've done it, and they've really liked what we've done here in Arizona. Is if you've made the minimum, you've met the minimum standard. Now we're going to invest in you for an undetermined amount of time with phased evaluations, while we teach you what we know. And the point is, if I invest in you on the front end, and it's different in the federal world than on the state and local side. And I will say that, generally speaking, on the federal side, we we do some kind of like field training for candidates, and then we send you to school. So you get a little bit of advantage before you go to school. I don't look at it like, and I've talked to local law enforcement, stuff like that, and they say, oh man, we just send them, and if they can't learn, then they can't hack it. Well, we've talked about repetitions, right? If they've demonstrated the minimum qualifications and the minimum standards, then I'd like to invest some time and give them some training before they go to school. Because if they get through school and I put a patch on their arm, then it's a much more meaningful experience. They just invested a lot of time and effort and training. And again, most teams are part-time. So they're doing this as a collateral duty. That they're not getting any extra money for this. Mm-hmm. It's just out of the goodness of their heart, and of course, a lot of us are probably a little bit of an adrenaline junkie and stuff like that. On the other side, the state side, they kind of go the other way. Oftentimes, I think, and they give them, they have very similar standards. They're physical, firearms, and all that stuff, and then they basically set them up and they go to SWAT school. And there's very little prep time before that, and oftentimes there's a higher washout rate, and that method may work very well for them. State and local teams are unquestionably busier than federal teams. They are more reactive to the public because their police force is what generates their call-outs. Mm-hmm. Whereas on the federal side, we are generally speaking doing more pre-planned, high-risk, operations, whether it's, warrant service, an undercover operation, or some sort of vehicular interdiction of some sort. So the training for feds, it's very physical once you get there. That's changed significantly since I went through 6 years ago. They PT these guys every day
to death.
All day, every day. They're wearing their body armor. They're wearing helmets. They're carrying rifles, which is bad enough when you're doing that for 10 hours. Mm-hmm. And then in between every iteration, you're doing push-ups. And then at the end of the day, you're doing an hour, some sort of CrossFit style workout where, for us anyways, they are building team camaraderie. Mm-hmm. They build this mentality of trust and loyalty in your team, and being a good follower and being a good leader, right? If you can be a good follower, your team will succeed because, just like in the military, if you follow orders, people live. Sometimes if you don't, they don't. And so it's a grind for 3 weeks. I go out there and guest instruct usually once a year, and I can't not do the workouts with them when they're doing the big ones at the end of the day. And it's inspiring because it keeps me, I'm not a spring chicken. I'm definitely not as old as you, but but I've got to stay in shape at 41 because I got 30-year-olds that are doing me under the table on the physical side.
Right.
And, so it is what it is, but it's important.
Yeah, I can say in little over 25 years in the federal service, I only had to call an SRT, a Fed SRT, reactively one time. So that gives you an idea versus if you're a PD, because most of the stuff that feds do, we're not responding to radio calls. We're not pulling traffic on the street or whatever. We generally know, not always, but usually know kind of what we're getting ourselves into. We can do research before we go knock on a door, that sort of thing. That's one of the big differences, which is why a patrol police officer, especially on a domestic violence call, is just the most dangerous thing you can possibly do in law enforcement. Jeff, I got to wrap it up. We're about out of time. Ladies and jelly spoons, believe me when I say his story is a very interesting one, a very harrowing one, and a very unique one. And hopefully in about a month and a half, something like that, maybe 2 months from now ish, assuming all the legal proceedings are done, we're going to get him back on. He can tell that story, and we won't have to go over your whole history because we've already been over it on this show. Jeff, man, is there anything else you wanted to mention before we let you go?
No, man. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for keeping being in touch still and doing what you do. And I obviously I keep track of you on social media and the podcast and the show and stuff like that. And you guys are doing God's work. So we appreciate you putting the word out there.
Thanks, brother. All right, gang. We are back once again with our friend, Stephen Gutowski. Stephen is the founder of TheReload.com. You can find him at TheReload.com. His articles and information, please consider getting a membership there. He is also the host of the Weekly Reload podcast, which is available in all the major podcast outlets. And if you are a member at TheReload.com, you get that a day early. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So this week is not fun. It's just not, you'd prefer not to think about these things, but front and center in the news, rightfully so, is the recent tragic, just unthinkable tragedy at the elementary school in Uvalde, Texas. And we are going to discuss the police response to that today, in as much as we know, the details that we have right now. Stephen, you and I talked offline before we hit the record button here. I just got done talking to a friend of mine who is law enforcement in a different part of Texas, who's a tactician, and he made the comment to me that it doesn't matter what facts might come out moving forward with this, that this department, these officers, this chief has already been tried and convicted in the the court of public opinion. And you responded, I think appropriately, by saying, well, the stuff we know already, the fact pattern we've already established, looks terrible. It just looks awful. And how do these sort of things happen? Well, I think we need to talk about this because we want to get better. We want our police to get better. We want our response to these things to get better. And what we know right now doesn't look good. It looks like they were told to wait and they followed that order to wait. And assuming that is in fact the case, and there's no other mitigating factors, it breaks my heart to hear that. I often say on the YouTube channel that we learned after Columbine. We do things differently. We don't go home, going home safely at the end of our shift isn't the focus of law enforcement. Your focus is when you can to protect innocent life. And it looks increasingly like that's not what happened the other day. There is an article over at The Reload about this. Talk to us about it, Stephen.
Yeah, I think it's very hard at this point, given what we've established as facts, the timeline involved here with that shooter being allowed to stay in that classroom unconfronted for upwards of an hour or more, actually, I believe, and think of anything that could come out that would excuse that decision.
Sure.
I've done. Look, I'm not a police officer. And just preface this. My grandfather was. My cousin is. I'm not. I haven't been in a gunfight. I haven't responded to an active shooter situation. So I don't want to pretend like, I'm been through it and I'm some veteran or whatever. But I have done active shooter training on several different occasions with the Israeli Tactical School, and then with Faster Colorado, which is a program where they train teachers to carry firearms in school, and that program does active shooter training, obviously, and it's taught by police officers who have responded to school shootings. And everything that we know now about the law enforcement response to the Uvalde school shooting contradicts just everything that you learned in active shooter training. And I know you've obviously have significant experience with that as well, which so I'm glad we're talking about it. But the number one principle is to immediately confront the shooter, immediately run, literally sprint, even if you have to go by yourself to where the shooting is occurring and engage with that shooter. Because we learned from Columbine, right? We were supposed to have learned from Columbine that just allowing these sorts of attackers, these monsters, to roam freely is likely to end in a lot more people being killed than would otherwise be the case. And I just cannot understand it. I cannot understand the decision-making whatsoever. And people need to be held responsible for what happened there. Kids died. Like, I don't think it's at this point, I think I'm comfortable saying that response got children killed. There was a child who was shot and bled out. And there was another child, a little girl, who was shot at the very end when the police finally did enter, which obviously indicates that whatever reason they had to think that the shooting had ended and it was a barricade situation, he was not done killing children at that point. But one thing we haven't touched on is the fact that not only did they decide not to go in, but they actively stopped parents from going in. And look, I understand that the officers who were securing that perimeter were told to do that, probably with the assumption that that whoever was in charge was going to be was making the proper decisions
right.
about when to go in, and you of course, in a normal circumstance, you wouldn't want random people or parents charging into a scene, but that's in a normal situation where law enforcement is charging into the scene. You know what I mean? So when they're effectively allowing that shooter to roam around in that classroom with kids dying while they're calling 911 for help repeatedly, as we know, it's hard to talk about, but you know, and they're arresting parents outside, they're tasing them, they're tackling them, because the parents understood, you know, the parents understood what was happening and why it was wrong. They didn't want their kids to be left in there with that shooter. And I mean, there was a story of one mother who was 40 miles away when she heard the news of the shooting, drove to the site, came upon the perimeter, tried to go through it when the police wouldn't charge in to confront the shooter, was put in handcuffs, convinced the officers to let her out of the handcuffs, then went to a different area of the school, climbed a fence, went inside, got her children, left the school before police actually went in to confront that shooter in that classroom. I mean, that just gives you, I think, the bottom line on how horrendous this operation was. I don't want to blame the individual officers on the scene. I think most police officers put in that situation, in an active shooter situation, would follow the proper training and try to risk their life to save the lives of those children. I genuinely believe that. I know officers who've done that, you know, but the leadership here is where I would try to focus most of my blame.
Yeah. You can, first of all, I've not heard that story about the mom who rescued her own kids. That's unbelievable. Secondly, with the knowledge now that they're not cooperating with the state, which is unprecedented as far as I know, I've never heard of such a thing in my entire life. With that in mind, I would like to think that their training records as the officers individually, as a department, will be poured over. I used to tell students in my firearms classes when I was a firearms instructor, hey, you know, I need you to get this stuff. I need you to take this seriously, and I need you to show proficiency with this or that skill with a firearm, because if you screw up, or if you are in a shooting that's even justified down the road, you're going to get sued, potentially charged, and guess who they're going to call to testify about your training? Me. So it reflects on me if you can't do your job properly. I'm willing to bet that someone hopefully is going to be poring over all of their training records, especially as it relates to firearms qualifications and active shooter response. I don't know what the training standard is. I don't know if there's a post system in Texas, but I'm going to find out to see how that works, to see if there is a standard for their active shooter response. Because
actually, there have been reports on the details of what the active shooter training was for that department. And in fact, I broke some news that they had held an active shooter training program in March in Uvalde High School, hosted by the police department. And the gist of it is they had the same standards. They were trained to the same standards as everywhere else in the country, right? This isn't, this is a thing that I think people need to really understand, is like the concept of active shooter response is pretty well formalized at this point, and
pretty simple.
And very simple. Yeah. You go to the gunfire immediately. Mm-hmm. Don't wait. Even if you see people who are injured around you, even children who are injured, you're supposed to go to where the gunfire is and intervene immediately. because that's the most likely way to get the best possible outcome. Obviously, the outcome is not going to be good regardless, but it'll be worse if you don't go and intervene.
Agreed. And the reason we covered this on the channel recently, there was a video where some crazy person had run someone over and run into a building and was shooting people. Mm-hmm. And in the body cam, the officer had to run past a guy who was pixelated out of the frame, but clearly was very badly injured. Mm-hmm. And I was explaining to our viewers that might seem callous, but you have to get the gunfire stopped first, because you're not going to get EMS or fire or anyone else in there to tend to your victims. You're not going to be able to concentrate on putting on a tourniquet or packing a wound until the shooting stops. So that's priority number one, is find whoever's shooting, whoever's doing whatever they're doing, and stop them from doing that. Usually that means shooting them and killing them.
Right.
And
I'll say this too. I interviewed a Colorado police officer who responded to a school shooting up there, and I thought and people can go read this. It was at the Free Beacon. If you just Google Free Beacon, Stephen Gutowski, police officer, school shooting, you'll be able to find it. But his account was effectively that, when something like this happens, everyone gets a call, right? Everyone anywhere nearby. And that seems to have happened in this case. Right? You had all sorts of different law enforcement agencies showed up, which, perhaps leads to some more questions about why they all agreed to go along with these decisions that were made. But regardless, so he went immediately to the school. And he arrived as two other officers from two other different law enforcement agencies arrived. They didn't know each other. They immediately started going through the school together, and they immediately went towards where they thought the shooter was. They didn't stop. They didn't wait. They didn't wait for shields or whatever else. They didn't wait for SWAT or some other sort of team to show up. They went inside and they immediately pursued the shooter. And you know what? And that's the reason that you do that, is because these shootings usually are over very quickly. Mm-hmm. And so if you wait 10 minutes, the person might have already killed 20 people. It's not hard to kill defenseless people in these situations, unfortunately. And a lot of these shootings are over very quickly. So if you don't try to intervene immediately, you're going to be too late to make any difference, as we saw here.
Yeah, our guest on the program that preceded this interview, Jeff, the federal agent, said that exact thing about the training. When it comes down to it, it's you get there as fast as you can, and if there's other law enforcement there, you form up quickly, very quickly, and you charge in and go to the gunfire. And that is clearly not what happened in this case. I'm sure this will not be the last time here in this space that we discuss this. Was there anything else you wanted to add, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, there were two officers, to be fair, that did try to intervene immediately. I don't know why the decision was made after that, after they got apparently minor injuries while engaging the suspect. I don't know why then everyone decided to wait an hour, but I just think at the end of the day, there's not going to be anything that comes out in my mind that's going to justify what was done. And I think it's indisputable at this point to say that at least some of those children died because of that inadequate response. And it's horrendous.
Agreed. It's really unthinkable and heartbreaking. Stephen, we're going to leave it there. Folks, do me a favor, head on over to thereload.com and consider getting a membership. Stephen relies on his members and his members only to continue the important work he's doing over there. Stephen, thank you for coming on, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Hey friends, this is John Correa. If you like the podcast, if it is bringing you value, do me a favor. Just rate the podcast and leave us a rating and a review. It really helps us out.